The air was thick with tension as a hush fell over the assembled crowd. They had gathered for justice. This was a day of reckoning. The criminal stood trembling, ready to face his punishment. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his hands clenched. The hooded enforcer's movements were slow and deliberate. All eyes were locked on him as he moved his gloved hand to his cloak. The criminal tensed, his heart pounded. Time seemed to slow. Then, with the flick of his wrist, the enforcer pulled out a radish. Historically, punishments could be pretty harsh and brutal. It was common for criminals to face the executioner or even endure prolonged torture under certain rulers. But not all of them were horrific, some of them were surprisingly funny. These are 10 of the most brutal and hilarious punishments in history on today's episode of the Infographics Show. Number 10. Raphanidosis. During ancient Greece, the law was strictly enforced during certain periods. After all, that's where the term draconian comes from. Draco was one of the many officials who believed in law and order. Not only were crimes like murder and theft punished, but so were adultery and sodomy. And one unique punishment for these crimes was raphanidosis, where the convicted would be taken to a public square for punishment and proceeded to have the root of a radish shoved directly where the sun don't shine. That's one way to get your daily helping of veggies. Radishes are pretty intense to eat, and the skin on the inside of the anus is highly sensitive. This punishment would quickly create an intense and lingering burning sensation in a very delicate spot. The punishment seems to be very rare, but ancient texts do mention it. One text even has a deluxe version, where fish were added to the mix because radishes weren't enough. But this might have been an artistic flourish by the author Gaius Valerius Catullus. But at least it wasn't as permanent as this next classical punishment. Number 9. Rhinocorrura. In the ancient world, one of the worst crimes was theft. It was considered a crime against the king, as well as endangering the welfare of whoever was robbed. So the more severe crimes were punished harshly, including the death penalty in some cases. But for those who were spared death, they were often marked in ways including branding. But the Egyptian king Akhtasanes took a more significant approach to marking these thieves by cutting off their noses. And that was just part one of the punishment. They were then exiled to the desert fortress known as Rhinocorrura. This literally translated to cut off noses, and it was populated entirely by these unlucky thieves. It was a city of noseless crooks trying to live their best nose-free lives. But if one escaped, they would instantly be identified by their distinctive look and returned to their open-air prison. This happened in antiquity, and there are also reports of an Egyptian border fortress named Charu, where corrupt officials were punished and exiled the same way. And is there any worse punishment than simply being forgotten? Number 8. Banishment. We've all been there. Maybe a girlfriend gets her haircut and you don't notice. Or mom could tell you didn't like her new meatloaf recipe, and then bam! It's the silent treatment. Now imagine that, but it's the whole country giving you the cold shoulder. Talk about next-level frustration. That is exactly what damnatio memoriae was, the punishment of being forgotten. Those deemed to have offended society to not only be exiled if still alive, but they could have also had their legacy destroyed in just about every way. And no one was safe from this, not even the A-listers of the time. Back in the day, rulers weren't just overthrown, they were erased. Pharaohs who messed with religion? Gone. Greek general Timotheus? Bang! Out of military records. Roman emperors? The Senate hit delete real quick. This largely fell out of favor in the modern day, but the Soviet Union would revise their records to minimize leaders who crossed their power brokers. Don't want to see you, don't want to hear you, don't even want to read about you. But when it comes to historic hilarious punishment, they don't get more iconic than humiliation. Number 7. The scold's bridle. The Middle Ages weren't exactly great if you were a woman, though let's be honest, not much has changed since then. Back then, the criminal codes at the time included theft, murder, and blasphemy, but it also included such offenses as gossiping and troublesome speech. Basically, being chatty was a crime. The majority of people convicted for them were women who spoke out of turn or were suspected of witchcraft. The government had a unique punishment for this, the scold's bridle or the witch's bridle. This was an iron mask designed to both look ugly and constrain the jaw, keeping them from speaking. And it was much worse than it sounds. The jaw isn't meant to be confined to one position for extended periods, so this would often cause extreme jaw pain and excessive salivation, and it would also affect eating. This was commonly used on female prisoners, but some victims were let loose in society. It was also common to attach a bell to the bottom of the mask like a walking shame alarm. This meant everyone could gather round and roast the victim. Nothing like a little public humiliation to bring the community together. But don't worry, it wasn't just the ladies who were the subject. Number 6. Drunkard's cloak. Life in the 16th century England was rough, so getting wasted was practically a survival strategy. Naturally, this meant there were a lot of drunks wandering the street. In 1551, public drunkenness was made a criminal offense, and the hard-nosed Oliver Cromwell made an attempt to shut down the alehouses. And in addition to fines and prison, the authorities used a punishment called the drunkard's cloak to shame those booze hounds and serve as a cautionary tale for the rest of the public. And the cloak turned the drunkard's best friend against him. The cloak was actually a barrel, with holes for the head, the legs, and small holes to barely stick your arms out. Drunks were released back into the community to wander around, fall over repeatedly, and no doubt plead for people to help them drink more booze. Sounds like harmless fun, right? It was, until they couldn't defend themselves and became easy targets for anyone with a grudge. Still, it made for some great street entertainment. But humiliation devices have a darker edge to them too. Number 5. The cangue. The cangue, used in East Asia for centuries, was like Europe's stocks, but with extra humiliation. It was essentially a large board that was fashioned around the victim's head, making them unable to reach their face with their hands. Their crimes were written on the sides, like a sandwich board of misdeeds. The criminal was unable to scratch their nose or their head, they just suffered the discomfort. But there was a darker side to this punishment too. If things went wrong, it could easily kill. The cangue was designed to make the criminal unable to feed himself, forcing him to rely on the kindness of strangers to help him eat and drink. The problem with this is, he's a criminal, and his crimes are on full display like the world's worst billboard. Depending on the offense, the people might actually enjoy watching him waste away. And many did. Despite this grim reality, the cangue stuck around, making it all the way to the early 20th century. But what's the worst part of a ritual humiliation? When the whole town gets in on it. Number 4. The Charivari. Everyone loves a parade. If you've ever been on a championship team, you'll remember the whole town showing up, throwing flowers and chanting your team name. Now imagine the exact opposite of that. And you have the Charivari. It's a shame parade designed to humiliate a member of the community. This was common in Europe and North America, and it would involve a wrongdoer being pulled from their home and dragged through the town square. And that's where the fun really began. The victim would be pelted with trash and food and serenaded with mocking music describing what an awful person they were. At the end of the parade, they would often be thrown into the water. While this was rarely fatal, it could result in a pretty nasty injury. There were attempts to do less violent versions. This included using an effigy of the person who was being targeted by the parade, which is still pretty funny. Imagine waking up one morning and the entire town is yelling at a doll that looks like you. But hey, at least you brought the whole community together for an event. But there was no historic punishment more bizarre than this one. Number 3. Poena cullei. During ancient times, a particularly brutal or despised criminal would occasionally come before the court, like a son who's killed his father. The problem was the death penalty was used pretty regularly, so that brings a glaring flaw. You can't exactly execute someone twice. So in Rome, they came up with a particularly strange, brutal, and creative punishment. In Poena cullei, the condemned would first be whipped. He would then have a hood placed over his head and wooden shoes on his feet, bundled into a sack, and then thrown into the river. Oh, and he wouldn't be alone. This ritual was designed to make the last moments particularly brutal, so the executioners would add a snake to the sack, and then a rooster, a monkey, a dog, and whatever other stray they could find. The whole menagerie would be tied up in a sack, and then they'd all be thrown into the water. As they started to drown, the animals would go absolutely nuts, tearing the criminal apart. This was used fairly sparingly during ancient Rome before being abolished. Like all good classics, it made a brief comeback during the Middle Ages in Germany, but eventually it was abolished for good. And we'd have to say we're glad, because what did the animals do to deserve that? But creative and brutal punishments haven't died out just yet. Number 2. Cinematic karma. Today, there are some people who are often seen as above the law, especially if they own property or businesses. These white-collar crooks just plead down criminal offenses to civil offenses and get off with a rap on the knuckles or a hefty fine. It's just the cost of doing business, as was the case for 71-year-old Florence Diamiti in 1998. Florence was a pretty bad landlord who had let her building deteriorate and left her tenants without heat, hot water, or electricity. She was found guilty of 6 violations and ordered to pay a fine and repairs. But she didn't follow through. Unfortunately for her, her judge was a fan of Hollywood. Judge Joanne Frita sentenced the lax landlord to at least 4 nights a week in the building for the next 60 days. Her tenants now had front row seats to her karma show. But for Florence, it was also a brutal period for the convict. At her age, the lack of basic protections felt dangerous, like a horror movie. Inspired by The Super, that's just what the judge was hoping for. We're guessing those repairmen were called in a hurry. But there's one thing that might be feared more than the law: mom and dad. Number 1. Buck ragging. Parental punishments can be pretty routine. Getting grounded, doing extra chores, or they can be terrifying, like when dad says, "Go cut a switch." But they're built differently out in the country. Some rural parents have resorted to a bizarre and surprisingly intense punishment called buck ragging. This comes from goat farmers who used rags when billy goats are in a rut and extra stinky. The rag is then presented to lady goats to see if they're in heat, and it's been described as one of the most disgusting smells in the world. And some parents have figured out how to weaponize it. Buck ragging is essentially when a parent grabs the kid and puts the rag over their face, giving them an ultra-intense taste of the smell. While many city parents would say it's abuse, country parents might say, "Get off my property and out of my business." This punishment might be rare, but there's proof it's out there. Goat farmers are selling their buck rags online and getting big bids from parents who don't even own goats, but can't wait to traumatize their kids like they were. Which one takes the cake for the worst punishment? Got something even more brutal but still hilarious in mind? Drop it in the comments and let the chaos begin. And if you're wondering who created the most infamous punishment of all time, we pitted the worst punishments across the world against each other in Worst Punishments in the History of the World by Country. Or check out Prison Torture, Worst Punishments in the History of Mankind, for an in-depth look at what happens in the big house.